This is not a war announcement, and it is not a sudden crisis that appeared overnight. There were no emergency summits, no dramatic statements, no single moment that forced the world to stop and react. But what is happening right now deserves attention. Because when China increases its level of support for a country already facing sustained international pressure, it is never random. It is never impulsive. And it is never done without a long-term calculation behind it. At first glance, this story may not feel urgent. There are no images of chaos, no countdowns, no visible escalation that immediately captures headlines. And that is exactly why it matters. In global affairs, the developments that shape the future are often not the ones that arrive with noise. They are the ones that arrive through continuity, through repetition, through decisions that look administrative rather than dramatic. China's increasing support for Venezuela fits into that category. It is being described publicly as cooperation, as engagement, as an extension of existing relations. And on the surface, that framing feels familiar. But familiarity can be misleading, because when major powers adjust their level of commitment, even slightly, the implications rarely stop at the bilateral level. They ripple outward, they change assumptions, they alter expectations, they force recalculations that may not be visible right away. This report is not about predicting conflict. It is not about announcing a turning point that has already arrived. It is about understanding what this increase in support represents in practical terms and why it is being underestimated by many observers. China does not approach international relationships the way many people expect. It does not prioritize speed. It does not prioritize visibility. And it does not prioritize emotional alignment. Instead, it prioritizes structure. China builds influence through systems, through presence, through arrangements that are designed to last long after the initial attention fades. And that is what makes this moment worth examining carefully. Because support, in this context, does not mean endorsement. It does not mean alliance in the traditional sense. And it does not mean confrontation with other global actors. Support means something more technical, more deliberate, and far more durable. When China decides to increase its engagement with a country under pressure, it is making a statement about relevance, not relevance today, relevance over time. It is signaling that this relationship is worth maintaining, even when conditions are complicated and options are limited. That signal alone is enough to change how others perceive the situation. This is where many interpretations go wrong. Some will immediately frame this development as a challenge to existing power structures. Others will dismiss it as routine diplomacy with no real consequences. Both reactions miss the point, because the most important effect of increased support is not what it announces publicly. It is what it normalizes quietly. It normalizes presence. It normalizes access. It normalizes continued engagement when others hesitate. And normalization is one of the most powerful tools in international politics. Once a major power becomes a constant factor in a country's external relationships, removing that presence becomes costly, not politically, operationally. This is especially relevant in the case of Venezuela. Venezuela operates in an environment shaped by constraints. Its access to traditional financial channels is limited. Its diplomatic flexibility is reduced. Its range of available partners is narrower than it once was. These conditions do not eliminate agency, but they do increase the value of stability. And stability, from China's perspective, is not about immediate outcomes. It is about predictability. Predictable environments allow long-term planning. They allow gradual expansion. They allow influence to be built without friction. That is why this increase in support matters now. Not because it changes everything overnight, but because it reinforces a pattern that is already in motion. China is not stepping into Venezuela for the first time. What is changing is the depth, the consistency, and the willingness to sustain engagement despite ongoing pressure. Those choices send signals far beyond Caracas and Beijing. They are noticed in neighboring capitals. They are tracked in policy circles. They are analyzed by actors who may not respond immediately, but who adjust their expectations accordingly. In international politics, expectation often shapes behavior before policy does. And behavior, once adjusted, becomes difficult to reverse. This is why developments like this rarely produce immediate headlines. They do not force reaction. They invite observation. An observation, when shared quietly among decision makers, can be more consequential than public debate. This report will not speculate about outcomes that cannot be confirmed. It will not draw straight lines to conclusions that have not yet materialized. Instead, it will focus on what can be observed, what increased support actually looks like, why the timing matters, and how this development fits into a broader strategic pattern. Because understanding these moves requires patience. It requires resisting the urge to label everything as escalation or crisis. And it requires recognizing that in global affairs, influence is often built long before it becomes visible. China's increased support for Venezuela is not designed to shock. It is designed to endure. And understanding that difference is essential to understanding what may come next. Now that we've established why this development matters, the next question is straightforward. What does support actually mean in practical terms? Because when China supports another country, the meaning of that support is often misunderstood. Many people imagine visible aid, public declarations, clear alignment, but China rarely operates that way. Chinese support is rarely concentrated in a single action. It is distributed across systems. It unfolds in layers, and those layers are designed to reinforce one another over time. The first layer is economic continuity. This does not always appear as new money announced publicly. More often it appears as sustained access to financing mechanisms that are already in place, access to credit structures that can be extended, restructured, or quietly renewed. This kind of support does not generate headlines because it does not need to. Its purpose is not to attract attention. Its purpose is to keep systems functioning. For a country operating under pressure, continuity itself becomes valuable. The second layer involves infrastructure. Chinese engagement frequently includes long-term infrastructure commitments, projects that take years to complete, projects that require maintenance, coordination, and ongoing presence. Once these systems are built, they do more than serve an immediate function. They create dependency on continuity, not political dependency, operational dependency. Infrastructure ties decision-making to maintenance, to logistics, to supply chains that cannot be easily replaced. This is one of the most durable forms of influence, because infrastructure does not argue, it simply exists. The third layer is institutional familiarity. Long-term engagement creates familiarity between bureaucracies. Processes align, expectations stabilize, communication channels become routine. Over time, this reduces friction. It becomes easier to coordinate, easier to negotiate, easier to resolve issues without escalation. This type of support does not appear dramatic, but it fundamentally alters how two systems interact. The fourth layer is diplomatic normalization. China does not typically frame its support as opposition to other actors. Instead, it frames it as cooperation, as development, as mutual interest. This framing matters because it allows engagement to continue without forcing others to respond publicly. There is no challenge that must be answered, no statement that requires rebuttal. Support becomes part of the background, and background conditions often shape outcomes more effectively than confrontations. This layered approach explains why China's support often appears understated. It is not designed to persuade public opinion. It is designed to function regardless of public attention. In the case of Venezuela, this model aligns closely with existing conditions. Venezuela does not require symbolic backing. It requires systems that can operate under constraint. China's approach provides that, not through sudden expansion, but through sustained engagement. Another important aspect of this support is flexibility. Chinese agreements are often structured to allow adjustment over time. Terms can be renegotiated, timelines can shift, priorities can be recalibrated. This flexibility reduces the risk of rupture. It allows the relationship to absorb pressure without collapsing, and that resilience is part of the value being offered. Support, in this sense, is not a guarantee of outcomes. It is a guarantee of continuity. And continuity in international affairs creates leverage, because leverage does not always come from strength. It often comes from reliability. When a partner remains present while others hesitate, that presence is noticed, not necessarily by the public, but by decision makers. This is where misunderstandings often arise. Observers sometimes assume that if support is not visible, it is not meaningful. But visibility is not the metric China uses. Durability is. This is also why Chinese support rarely arrives with deadlines. There is no countdown, no expiration that forces rapid conclusions. The relationship is allowed to evolve, and evolution rather than acceleration is the core of this strategy. In Venezuela's case, increased support does not mean a sudden shift in alignment. It means reinforcement of an existing trajectory. It strengthens mechanisms that are already in place. It deepens engagement that has already been normalized. This kind of support does not demand loyalty. It rewards continuity. And over time, continuity reshapes incentives. Decision makers begin to factor long-term engagement into short-term choices. They plan differently. They prioritize stability. They avoid actions that could disrupt established systems. This does not eliminate disagreement, but it changes how disagreement is managed. Instead of rupture, there is adjustment. Instead of confrontation, there is negotiation. This is why support in this context is not an announcement of alignment against anyone. It is an investment in staying power, and staying power often matters more than statements. As we move forward in this report, the focus shifts from how this support functions to why the timing matters now, why this reinforcement is happening at this specific moment, and what that suggests about broader strategic calculations beyond the bilateral relationship itself. Now that we understand how this support functions in practice, the next question is timing. Why Venezuela? And why now? Timing in international politics is rarely coincidental. It reflects opportunity, constraint, and calculation aligning at the same moment. In Venezuela's case, several conditions have converged. First, there is the issue of strategic availability. Venezuela operates in a space where options are limited, but engagement remains possible. It is neither isolated to the point of inaccessibility, nor open in a way that invites uncontrolled competition. This creates a narrow corridor for sustained involvement. For external actors willing to commit for the long term, such corridors are valuable. They reduce volatility. They allow planning without constant recalibration. Second, there is the question of regional context. South America is not experiencing a single unified shift. It is experiencing divergence. Different countries are moving at different speeds, under different pressures, and toward different priorities. This fragmentation matters. In fragmented environments, influence tends to consolidate around nodes rather than spread evenly. Venezuela represents one of those nodes, not because it dominates the region, but because decisions involving Venezuela resonate beyond its borders. When a major power deepens engagement there, regional actors take notice. They may not react publicly. They may not alter policy immediately, but they reassess. They ask what this means for access, for leverage, for long-term balance. This reassessment process is subtle, but it is consistent. Third, there is the issue of endurance. Venezuela has demonstrated an ability to operate under prolonged pressure. That does not imply comfort or success. It implies resilience. From a strategic standpoint, resilience matters. It signals that engagement will not be short-lived. For a partner focused on durability rather than rapid outcomes, this resilience is a key factor. China does not prioritize relationships that promise quick wins followed by instability. It prioritizes environments where engagement can be maintained, adjusted, and expanded gradually. Venezuela fits that profile. Another factor shaping the timing is global distraction. International attention is divided across multiple regions and issues. Diplomatic capacity is stretched, policy focus is fragmented. In such periods, incremental moves carry disproportionate weight. They are less likely to trigger immediate pushback, less likely to be framed as challenges requiring urgent response. This does not mean they go unnoticed. It means they are absorbed into broader calculations rather than isolated as flashpoints. That absorption process is precisely what makes them effective. As China reinforces its engagement with Venezuela, the impact extends beyond bilateral ties. It alters regional expectations. Countries neighboring Venezuela begin factoring China's presence into their own strategic planning. Not because they intend to respond directly, but because the environment in which they operate has changed. Diplomatic initiatives are assessed differently. Economic partnerships are recalibrated. Long-term projects are viewed through a new lens. This is not alignment. It is adaptation. And adaptation is often the first visible effect of shifting influence. Another important dimension is how this engagement affects regional institutions. Formal responses may be minimal, statements may be neutral, but internal discussions evolve. Assumptions about external involvement are updated, scenarios are revised. In international systems, institutions often respond through process rather than posture, by adjusting frameworks rather than issuing declarations. This gradual adjustment rarely draws public attention, but it shapes outcomes over time. It is also important to note what this does not trigger. This increase in support does not immediately provoke regional polarization. It does not force countries to choose sides. Instead, it introduces an additional variable into an already complex equation. And additional variables complicate simple narratives. They make linear predictions less reliable. They slow down reaction cycles. From China's perspective, this complexity is not a disadvantage. It creates space. Space to engage without confrontation. Space to operate without constant scrutiny. Space to build presence while others are still assessing the situation. This is why the impact of this development should not be measured by immediate reaction. It should be measured by gradual adjustment, by how conversations change behind closed doors, by how planning documents evolve, by how expectations shift quietly across the region. In this sense, Venezuela functions as a reference point rather than a trigger. It anchors discussions. It informs assumptions. It shapes how future developments are interpreted. As China's support becomes more normalized, its presence becomes part of the regional baseline. And baselines are powerful. Once established, they frame what is considered normal, acceptable, or expected. Reversing a baseline requires effort. Maintaining it requires only continuity. This is why developments like this often feel anticlimactic in real time. They do not announce transformation, they enable it. As we move into the final part of this report, the focus shifts again, from regional implications to global interpretation, how other major actors read this development, why responses may be delayed, and what common misreadings miss about the nature of strategic commitment. As this development continues to unfold, the most revealing reactions are not the loud ones, they are the restrained ones. When major global actors observe a shift like this, their first response is rarely public. It is analytical. They study the pattern, they examine the durability of the move, they assess whether the engagement is temporary or structural, and in this case, the signals point toward structure. China's increasing support is not framed as an emergency measure, it is framed as continuity. That distinction matters because continuity suggests intention beyond the immediate moment. It suggests planning that extends into future negotiation cycles, future economic arrangements, and future diplomatic recalibrations. This is why reactions from other global actors may appear muted. Silence in this context should not be confused with indifference. It reflects calculation. When a major power adjusts its posture without forcing confrontation, others respond by observing rather than reacting. They wait to see whether the move settles into routine. If it does, it becomes part of the strategic environment. And environments shape behavior more effectively than statements. This is where one of the most common misinterpretations occurs. Many observers expect global politics to operate through dramatic moments, through declarations that clearly define sides and outcomes, but most long-term shifts do not announce themselves that way. They emerge through normalization, through repetition, through continued presence that gradually becomes expected. Another frequent misunderstanding is assuming that support must immediately translate into alignment against someone else. That assumption oversimplifies how modern global relationships function. Support can exist without confrontation. Engagement can deepen without escalation. In fact, many strategic partnerships are designed specifically to avoid forcing binary choices. They allow room for adjustment. They preserve flexibility. They delay polarization. China's approach reflects this logic. By framing its support as cooperation rather than opposition, it avoids triggering immediate defensive responses. By maintaining a steady pace, it reduces the likelihood of overreaction. This does not mean the move lacks consequence. It means the consequences unfold over time rather than through sudden shifts. Another error is equating patience with hesitation. In many strategic cultures, patience is not a lack of resolve. It is an expression of confidence. Confidence that time works in favor of sustained engagement. Confidence that presence, once established, does not need constant reinforcement. This mindset contrasts sharply with systems that rely on rapid signaling and immediate visibility. Neither approach is inherently superior, but they operate on different timelines. Misreading one through the lens of the other leads to flawed conclusions. This is particularly relevant when assessing what comes next. There is a tendency to ask whether this development will lead to a larger confrontation, whether it signals the beginning of a broader global rupture. Those questions, while understandable, are premature. They assume linear progression. Global politics rarely moves in straight lines. More often, it advances through adjustments, through recalibration, through incremental changes that accumulate before outcomes become visible. What this development does indicate is a shift in how future negotiations may be shaped. When discussions occur months or years from now, China's presence will already be accounted for. Its engagement will already be factored into assumptions. That alone alters the negotiating environment. And altering the environment is often more impactful than altering positions. This is why developments like this are difficult to reverse. Once expectations adjust, reverting to previous baselines requires effort. It requires renegotiation. It requires disruption. Maintaining the new baseline, by contrast, requires only consistency. As this report has shown, China's increasing support for Venezuela is not a single action. It is a series of reinforcements layered over time. Each layer on its own may appear limited. Together they form a durable presence. That presence does not dictate outcomes. but it shapes the conditions under which outcomes are negotiated. This distinction is crucial. Influence is not always about control. Often it is about context, about being part of the conversation before the conversation becomes public. This is why waiting for visible consequences can be misleading. By the time outcomes are obvious, the groundwork has already been laid. The decisions that mattered most have already been made. This report is not an attempt to predict conflict, nor is it an attempt to minimize risk. It is an effort to understand how global actors position themselves ahead of decisive moments. China's increasing support for Venezuela reflects a broader strategic logic, one that values endurance over urgency, presence over performance, and continuity over spectacle. Support, in this sense, does not announce a conclusion. It prepares the terrain, and preparation often matters more than prediction. As this situation continues to evolve, attention should remain focused not on dramatic shifts, but on patterns, on consistency, on repetition, on how engagement becomes normalized over time. Because in global politics, what becomes normal often becomes decisive. This has been a report on how influence is built before it becomes visible, on how strategic relationships deepen without demanding attention, and on why developments that appear procedural today may shape negotiations tomorrow. This is before anyone noticed.